Hey guys, done here. Just getting ready for the final discussion in our live series of Larry Brooks's book, Story Engineering. For anyone who is just joining us for the series, this is the book we are reading, Story Engineering by Larry Brooks. You can find it on Amazon. It's a great book. And today is our final discussion. So we are talking about parts 7 and 8 in Story Engineering, and covering the final core competency, which is writing voice, and then talking about some development of how to actually take the ideas and the stuff you've been working on and turn it into an actual story plan. One quick thing I'm going to say, I totally forgot I have to go to the dentist today. So they called me this morning and reminded me, thankfully, because I totally would have forgotten, but I have to be there at 2. So I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes because I just don't want to miss my appointment. So we'll talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we have a live call tonight with Larry. So if you are wanting to, join us for that, and I'm going to put in the comments right here, let's see, the call-in information. So this is I'm putting it in the comments right now. So if you want to join Larry and I for the live call that's happening tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern, the call details are in the comments, so you can go and get them. There are only 25 phone spots, so if you call in on the phone and it tells you that it's full, you can go to the web link, because the web link is unlimited, so as many people as you want can listen on the web. It's just the phone is limited. So if you want to be on the phone, get there early so that you can have a phone spot. So yeah, welcome, and let's jump right in. So like I said, I'm going to set my timer for 30 minutes just so I don't keep talking and then forget about my appointment. So okay, cool. So today we're talking about the 6th core competency, which is writing voice. So this is something that it's kind of hard to talk about, only because obviously there's a ton to know about it, but I feel like more of it comes from just practicing. So just like figuring out what your writing voice is by writing and really by doing it. So I'm going to just sort of talk through some of the stuff Larry mentioned, and especially talking about dialogue, because that is obviously a big part of the writing voice when you are writing fiction. So writing voice is how you narrate and write your story, basically. So it's how you bring your scenes to life. It's how you, everything that you have to do to bring it to life on the page is your writing voice. That's what's, going to bring it all together. And so Larry talked about in this section how you have to write like a pro. So you have to find your style, but you also have to be professional when it comes to your grammar and your punctuation and your style and all of that. Now, this isn't true for dialogue, but this would be for, your narrative and the story exposition and all of that. So it has to be executed professionally. It's not just about, writing really pretty words, but it's about, are you weaving the story in? Is the story coming to life by the way you're talking about it and telling it? So, that's your writing voice. And the only way to find your writing voice is to practice. It's to write a shitload. And the more you write, the more you're going to find your writing voice. So like for me, I started blogging in 2008. And at the time, I had just, I was a couple of years out of journalism school. I had learned a lot about writing. I had written a ton over the years, but I hadn't really found what I would call my voice or like my flow. And so blogging, I made myself a goal of writing 1 blog post a week for a whole year. And as I did that, I started to develop my writing voice. So I started to find who I was as a writer and really, what was that voice that I wanted to put out through my words. And now that same voice comes into play a lot of the times in my fiction, and obviously it's based on the character who's speaking and all of that. But I found that writing voice and that flow because I practiced so much and because I wrote as much as I possibly could, everything I could possibly write. So not just fiction, but writing nonfiction, writing blog posts, writing articles, writing ebooks. All of that taught me how to find my writing voice. And so I've written, thousands of things over the last 8-9 years. And so that's how you find your writing voice. It's just practice, 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 practice. So yeah, you have to plan, you have to develop your stories, you have to work really hard on all of that. But you also want to make sure that you are practicing by doing the writing, because that's the only way you're going to find your writing voice. And because this is a core competency, it's a really important part of, actually getting yourself published. So whatever it is you're doing, planning, learning stories, studying structure, all of that is great, but just make sure you're still doing some writing practice as well. So even if that's like, let's say writing short stories or just picking a random, writing prompt and then using that to sort of guide you through some practice time. I think there are some writing teachers who suggest like you shouldn't write something unless you're actually going to do something with it. So like writing with a purpose. And I agree with that as far as like you should write with a purpose. You should, actually have a specific mission and a goal for each of the things that you create, whether that's a blog post that you're trying to get someone to take action on, or whether that's an ebook that you want to help someone overcome something or get a result of some kind, or whether it's a novel. I mean, whatever you're writing. But there's something to practicing and just writing stuff you're never going to actually use. So I actually have a couple of folders on my computer. So on my desktop, one is called fiction files. So basically I have just all this random stuff in there that's me practicing my fiction writing. So these aren't things that are in a story necessarily, but it's just a scene that came in my head that's random. It doesn't go with any story. It just kind of popped in my head. So rather than try to build a whole story around it, I just wrote it in my fiction files. So I sort of practice my fiction writing and bringing in description and, narrative and all that stuff. And it's just practice. So I'm not, no one sees that folder. It's just my stuff, and no one, comes across any of it. So it's cool. I can just practice. I can do my writing, but it helps me to get that voice, down, and it helps me to just keep going and keep practicing. I also have another thing that I call fodder for fiction, which is a file that I have that has notes and all these different ideas for potential things I could write fiction-wise. A lot of it I haven't used yet. It's just in there, but I'll use that as prompts sometimes to actually write in my fiction files in my practice time. So there's definitely something to having practice time, even if it's not for a purpose other than just practicing. So maybe you're writing with the purpose of that and not necessarily to publish it, but I feel like practice is still a really important purpose, and it's definitely something that you want to keep doing as much as you possibly can. So Larry talks about this, making sure that you're practicing. The other thing I say is hire an editor. So at some point your practice, you're going to write your draft. You're going to get to a point where you can't really think of what else you need to do now. Like, you finished it, you don't know. So now is the time to bring in an editor who can really look at it for you, look at the words and how you've done everything, and just give you some feedback that could help you improve it and make it better. Because again, you're so close to your own writing that it's sometimes hard to see, is this any good? Am I doing a good job? And a lot of times an outside perspective will come in to be able to tell you whether or not you are. So, and usually they're not going to say, oh my God, this is a total disaster. Because I will say, and Larry has mentioned this before too, and the idea of we're all writers. I mean, the reason we're attracted to being storytellers and to writing is because it's a skill that we have. So we're pretty good at it. If we weren't, we would probably be off doing something else, like playing guitar or painting pictures, So we're, here because we're writers. So obviously you're going to be good at it naturally from that, just being born with the gift of writing. But that doesn't mean you know how to do it as professionally as it would be in a book or something. So you definitely want to learn grammar and, that kind of thing if you don't already know it, which again, it's sort of intuitive, I feel like, for people who are good at writing. It just, from reading and from writing all these years of our lives, like we sort of just are good at it from that. But it never hurts to have someone else look at it, because for me, I have a really bad habit of switching back and forth, on tenses. So I'll think I'm writing in present tense, and then all of a sudden I'll be switching to past without even realizing it. So that's of course why I have an editor, because they can point out to me, oh, you switched tenses here, and just help me to pick up on that stuff if I don't catch it myself. So Sean, do you mean a paid editor or a first reader friend situation? Well, I think it depends on where you're at with your draft. So for me, I will write my first draft. I let it sit for 6 weeks or so, and then I'll go back and start revising. Once I finish the revised version, it goes to an editor and my beta readers. Now, this is because I've done enough planning, I've done enough all of the development that I know I have an actual story. So it's obviously going to be dependent on whether or not you have an actual story once you're finished with the draft. So for me, that's my process. It goes to an editor and beta readers, and then it comes back to me. I make revisions based on what they told me, and then I actually send it through to get proofread and stuff, and then I actually put it out into the world. So I think it's just dependent on where you're at in the process, whether you need a paid editor or a friend to read it. Although I highly recommend you don't use your friends as much as possible, only because they're too close to you. They're not going to tell you the truth, and even if they say they will, it's just not gonna, their lens that they're reading it from is automatically going to be different because they know you and because they are friends with you. So that's why it's important to find someone who doesn't know you, who isn't really your friend yet, like someone you've just met, or an editor or someone like that, because that's just going to make it easier for them to tell you the truth about what your story really is or isn't. Janet, what do you look for in a decent beta reader? Well, for me, I think I have two things. So I have a variety of beta readers. So I usually have a group of 4 to 5 people that I use. I I mostly look for to have a handful of people who are just readers of my genre. So I look for friends I might know from college or things who I know read that type of fiction. So if you read chick lit, basically I just put a thing out. If you read chick lit and you want to read this book, like I would love to get you to read it and just sort of get your perspective. So I get the reader. They're not really editors. They don't know a lot about storytelling. They're just readers. So I like to have that group for beta readers. And then I also like to have a group of beta readers who are also writers and who understand the principles of storytelling and the narrative and how to write and characterization and all that stuff, because they can look at it from the perspective of, oh, well, this doesn't, this needs more characterization, or this needs, whatever. So they're sort of looking at it from an editorial perspective as a beta reader. So I get both of that in there. Just because, again, I like to be sort of well-rounded in the fact that, like, I'm not just getting feedback from critics or from editors, but I'm also getting it from people who read my genre. So one of my beta readers for Soundcheck, she was amazing because she reads tons of books in chick lit. So when she read mine, she was like, okay, she's like, this is great. And she was like, but here are some suggestions. Like, I don't think the character would do this. I was hoping that she would do this instead. Like, I was imagining. And so she just listed off things that I felt like, well, because she reads so much of this genre, just like I do, that she has some really good ideas. And so it was really, worth using them because of that. And this is sort of off topic of the writing voice, but you know what I mean? So, great question. Beta readers are really important and they're hard to find sometimes. That's why I always recommend, like, if you are someone who could be a beta reader, it's a great service to offer up to other writers because they are definitely in need of it. Let's see, Corey, maybe fellow band members would be good beta readers. Yeah, I mean, potentially just post in the group and ask them. I'm sure that if, someone has the time, that they'd be happy to. Janet, do beta readers do this for free, or what is a reasonable fee? Well, it depends. So sometimes they do it for free, like if you're doing an exchange. So let's say like you're reading for someone and they're reading for you. Well, then it could be a free thing because it's exchanged. I usually pay beta readers anywhere from $150 to $250 based on the length of the manuscript. Now that's kind of, I don't know, maybe that's low, but they're normally, that's what they charge me so far. So that's been what I've paid. But again, it's up to the person that you're dealing with. So sometimes they'll do it for less, sometimes more. Some of the beta readers who are like editors, I would obviously be paying more because they have that skill set that a regular reader doesn't have. So a regular reader, I would just pay, like $150 because they love reading. They're going to read the book. They would read it anyway. So for them to get paid to read it is just like a bonus. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Okay, but just keep us on track because, like I said, I only got a really short period of time today, and then I have to stop. So I've got an appointment at 2. Okay, so going back to talking about the writing voice, so dialogue is a big part of storytelling, and Larry was talking about this in story engineering, that dialogue is, a big part of it, and when you're a fiction writer especially, it's something you have to learn how to do, so it's a part of your writing voice. It's a part of how you tell a story and, how you use dialogue to tell that story. So I think that's a really key thing because a lot of times writers, especially if you don't write a lot of dialogue, you don't realize that, like, the way dialogue is written is totally different than the way you would write narrative. So a lot of times, narrative is going to be more professional, I would say, but just more like it fits more with the grammar and all of that stuff. Whereas when you're talking dialogue, well, then you want to talk the way people talk. So people don't really say things in long speeches. They say things in quick, short sentences. And sometimes they just use one word or two words. So, keeping that in mind as you work on your writing voice is learning how to write dialogue. So something that helped me with writing dialogue from a long, again, because I took a ton of fiction classes when I was growing up, and it was just one of those things that, like, I don't know, I was just a big fan of dialogue. I've always loved writing dialogue, so I've had a lot of practice at it. But just go somewhere, go people watch somewhere, go to a cafe, go to the mall, wherever, and just listen to the way people talk. Listen to how they talk about stuff and the way they say things. And the other thing is, people will say things like and and all of that stuff you don't put into your dialogue in a story, obviously. But it's just cool to sort of pay attention to how people talk. You could even just record, like ask one of your friends to have a conversation with you and record it and just listen back at it and just see like all the way that they talk about things and how they describe stuff. So, that was how I learned to write dialogue, was really just paying attention to how real people talk. And then, of course, using my story sense or my intuition on how I think people would say things. For me, a lot of times my stories come to me as dialogue. So I think that's why I'm supposed to be writing screenplays, and that's why I'm actually looking into that for this year, because I think that I would be a good screenplay writer because I do pretty good dialogue. So, but yeah, so that's another skill, again, part of the writing voice, and definitely something that you want to practice and have part of your just development of your story. All right, so one thing, this is something that's a sort of a pet peeve of mine, and I think a lot of writing teachers, and Larry mentions it too in here, is when you're writing dialogue, use the word said. So a lot of times writers think they have to get creative, they have to say, all these other fancy ways of saying said, because said is too repetitive, it's too boring, it's too plain. But the thing that it actually, when you don't use said, when you use other things, that she, shouted, she joyfully screamed, or whatever, actually saying it like that makes it more distracting for the reader, because readers are used to said, so they kind of just read over it. They don't even notice that it's there. But when you start saying things like, she screamed it, she did this, like, it's more noticeable. So yeah, maybe once in a while someone has to scream something, but most of the time they're just going to say it. Just use said. That's and I know that Larry agrees on this one. That was something we've actually talked about before. Is just like the overuse of things other than the word said. Don't do that. Use the word said. That's a big part of dialogue. It's a big part of the writing voice. And it's another piece of that being professional. Doing it professionally is using said, because that's what publishers expect. That's what editors expect, because that's how it's done. So huge way to point yourself out as a beginning writer or as an amateur is to do something other than that. So just a little tip there. Okay, but again, I always think the writing voice is just something you get practice. And Larry mentioned writing voice is really earned through practicing. So you grow into it. You sort of become this writing voice as you do it more. So for me, I know blogging is really what helped me find my writing voice, because I wrote a lot of blog posts. I mean, the first year, 52 blog posts. And then after that, it was like 2-3 times a week. Now I write sometimes 5 times a week. I don't always publish it on my blog, but I always send it out to my email list. So I've got tons of practice in the writing voice. And again, even though that's not fiction, it's still the voice of me as the author. And that's the whole idea of writing voice, is it's the voice you use to tell your stories, and you as the author. And then another piece of writing voice is obviously like your point of view that you're writing the story in. So is it first person? Is it third person? And, how am I executing on that? So just some things to think about. And just a last point from Larry on that is he says that good writing is effortless. So when you read a novel and you fall in love with it and you just think it's so great, that's because the writing voice was awesome, that's because the writing voice was really good, and it kept you engaged, and it didn't detract from the story. Because a lot of times when there's a really bad writing voice, or the person just isn't very, doesn't have enough practice in this yet, you'll see that their writing voice stands out too much. And that's what you don't want. You want it to sort of just be there and be this like blanket that brings the story to life, but you don't want it to be, like a flashing red light that says, hey, this is my writing voice, because then it's probably too obvious. So you want it to be effortless. You want it to flow and be cohesive, and you don't want it to just be like, what the hell happened? So that's writing voice. And again, there's tons of books out there about this topic, writing voice. There's a lot of them that you could probably get. And I wish I could have a recommendation for one specifically, but I can't off the top of my head think of one. But if you are interested in dialogue, there's a great book it's a Writer's Digest series. Let's see, it's on my shelf right here. It's Write Great Fiction. It's called Dialogue. And I've gone through it. There's a lot of great exercises in there to practice writing dialogue and all of that. So definitely check that one out. All right, so now part 8 of story engineering. So this is the final section of the book, and we're talking about the story development process. So this is actually how you take the idea that you have and all the principles that you've learned for the last, 5, 6, 7 days, and put them into practice into the actual story. So implementing them, executing on them in the story. So every writer has to have a process that they use to take these principles and turn them into an actual story. And if you can't do that, that's going to be a huge block for you, because you can't just write anything and think it's a story. It has to fit these principles. So you have to be able to not only understand the principles, but then you also have to be able to implement them on your own stories. And so something that Larry mentioned in story engineering, which I think is probably the most important piece of how you develop a story, is a beat sheet. So he talked about a beat sheet being a way to really come up with all the scenes of your story. So to take all these ideas and everything you've developed up to this point, your character arc and your structure, and actually now hit the ground running with, okay, where's the story? what's the connecting pieces, what has to happen to get to that plot point, what has to happen to get away from that plot point and make everything be cohesive. So really focusing on each beat is a mission or a purpose for that scene. So it's, again, talking about scenes like we talked about yesterday. Each one has to have one action or mission or goal or new information, whatever it is that's coming in, it's one. So each one is a beat, and that becomes its own scene. So going through and saying, okay, what do I need to have happen in part 1 to set up my plot point, my first plot point? And what do I need to have happen in part 2 to go from my plot point, my first plot point, to my midpoint? And then what do I have to do from part 3 to go from my midpoint to my second plot point? And then, of course, from the second plot point to the end. So again, looking at the context and the story you've developed, and then figuring out the beats based on that. And so some other options, he mentioned a beat sheet, and if you go to his blog, there's actually a template that you can download that has, it's like a template for a beat sheet. So you can basically just download it and use it for your own story. Some other options that I've seen people do, index cards, obviously, or post-it notes. So that's another big one. You can do this in Scrivener. So you can storyboard in Scrivener and do each beat, one index card on Scrivener. You could use Trello. So Trello.com is a storyboarding, or pretty much just like a virtual corkboard. So you could use it for anything, but planning out a story is a great way to do it. I had a client once who used that. And it was really cool for organization and just keeping track of everything digitally and in the cloud, so you can access it anywhere, which is nice. But yeah, so your beat sheet, again, is going to focus on that one specific mission for each scene. And you can do a pre-draft beat sheet, and you can also do a post one. So I like to do both. I actually go through, find the specifics of my story, and then I do my beat sheet, do my scene roadmap, and then I actually write my draft. Then afterward, I go back through and I create a post-draft beat sheet that actually goes through, okay, what points are the same, and I move everything over. What points are changing, and then I change them and sort of reorganize and fix them in the post-draft sheet. From there, I actually develop into index cards so that I can look at each one individually with all the scene information and then write from there. But that's my post-draft. But my pre-draft, I actually prefer to have like a printed out, so like a, just like a worksheet that I printed out. So I have a bunch of worksheets that I've made, and I use, it's called a story roadmap. So I basically designed it so it covers, all the information of what's in the scene, what has to be there, but then it also expands on what's the location, what's the time the scene is taking place, what information is going to get told in the scene, what's the mission of it, is this a scene where we're reacting to something, or are we taking action on something, like sort of just developing out all the little pieces of each scene. But you can't just jump right to that. You have to have the beat sheet to use as a guide for jumping to that. So the beat sheet is more the bones of the story, and then the story roadmap is the expanded version of all of those beats into actual, full scenes. So that's how I like to sort of do it. That's my process of developing. So how do you guys do it? I would love to sort of hear from you now. How do you develop a beat sheet or a scene list for your story? Do you use index cards? Do you like to write it out on paper? I am a big hand planner, so I like to write things by hand when I'm planning. And so I have usually a moleskin for each story that I write, and then I've also got printed out worksheets that I use. I develop everything that way, and then when I actually am ready to start writing, I move that into Scrivener. So I have each scene is set up as an index card, and then I write everything right in Scrivener. And then when I go back and do my revision, that's also hand planning. So I basically do the beat sheet on paper, turn that into index cards. I don't know. For me, that's just, I don't know. I have this connection with writing by hand, and I find it to be really powerful for me. So that's why I do it that way. But I know a lot of people love the digital planning. Scrivener is great. KM Weiland actually has a app coming out soon where you can actually use her book, structure or outline your novel, or I forgot what it's called, outline your novel, I think. But you can use her little process and actually use this app to create it. So there's a lot of different things out there that you can use to do this. These are just some of the ways that I've done it, and again, that Larry talked about in his book. Let's see. Corey says, I use my laptop using Larry's beat sheet page. Awesome. Yeah. So, everyone has their own way of doing it. And I think that's, it's good because you have to find a process. If nothing else, you have to be able to figure out how to take all these principles and these ideas and turn them into concrete story on paper. And in order to do that, you've got to have some sort of a process. That's, true of anything. There's a process in everything pretty much in life. So even though you have to do it your own way. You still want to figure out, okay, well, what works for me? So try different things. Try a beat sheet, try a roadmap, try, index cards and Post-it notes, and just see what you like and what resonates most for you. Because I've just found that you have to do what works for you. So maybe your development is just writing drafts. So if you're someone who likes to write drafts, you may not even do any of these little planning things. You may just sit down and plan by drafting. So you may write 2, 3, 4, 5 drafts to find your story, and then finally write a full draft that's the actual story once you've found it through writing these other drafts. I could never do it that way. I've tried it. Just more power to anyone who can write that many words and keep going, because I can't. So no, I get so frustrated. Like if I write a whole draft and then I have to scrap most of it, like I don't even want to finish. I'm just like, no. So that's why I plan first, because that way that doesn't happen. Because otherwise I will end up not finishing anything, which is just never good. So yeah, let's see. Evangelia says, I use a straight horizontal timeline and hang notes from it like a clothesline. Oh, that's a cool idea. That actually would be cool too. You could hang a clothesline with like clothespins and, little index cards pinned all the way across. That would be cool too. So that's great. I mean, I think, again, lots of ways to plan a story. Writer's Digest has tons of books on this. They've, I think like Plan Your Story in 30 Days or something, and lots of worksheets, lots of things. But what it really comes down to isn't just digging into these, surface level pieces of the story. It's really using the principles that Larry talked about in story engineering and going deeper and really giving yourself the full picture of your story before you write it. And so here's a really cool exercise that Larry talks about. I don't remember if he talked about it in the book or not. He may have. But I learned this from him. It's been amazing. It's actually helped me a lot to figure out, just learning structure and all of that. So basically what you do is you would watch a movie, pick a movie, in your genre, most likely, if you want to sort of see how it plays out, but also try other genres. But pick a movie and then get a piece of paper or a notebook. And as the movie plays out, write the generic mission of each scene that you're watching unfold. So remember, and keep in mind again that a scene is a change of time or place. So watching how the scenes sort of change through the movie, and then thinking about what is the generic mission of this scene. So what is happening in this scene specifically? What is the mission? What is the purpose of it? How does it move the story forward? And so just write that out and do the generic version. So don't tell us exactly what's happening, but tell us, what the mission is. So for example, maybe it's introducing the protagonist. That's the mission of that scene. Introducing the, hinting at the antagonistic force. That's the mission of the next scene, and, that kind of thing. So really thinking about it in a generic sense, because that's going to help you to look at, okay, you just saw a specific story with looking at the generic missions of the story. So you could almost take those generic missions and use it to create another story. And it would be totally different because the generic mission isn't exactly the same based on, the story. So again, this is more if you're looking for like a formula. I'm not big on that, but it's a good exercise in just understanding how to find the generic mission of something. So, and if you want more of like a specific structure like that tells you every little thing you should do, there's a great website. Oh my God, what is it called? Better Novel Project. So Better Novel Project, she actually has, she's done structure breakdowns of literally like all these fantasy stories and like just tons, like she did one of Hunger Games. And so basically of the parts in each of the scenes, and she wrote them out. So you can sort of look at that as an outline for whether, what the mission of the scene is. And then you can almost use that for anything, because if you think about it, it's just a generic skeleton. So it's okay, introduce the antagonist, introduce the protagonist, hint at something that's coming. So these are just general, but they're also things that you could use to guide you in creating your own stuff. So anyway, so that's just an exercise that's good for studying structure and to just really help you to learn better on understanding how to find the purpose of a scene. All right, Corey says, yes, I've been thinking that there is a way of doing something like that while watching movies. Yeah, totally. I mean, again, it takes some practice because you have to really be thinking about the mission. And the other thing is you have to keep yourself paying attention the whole time and not get stuck in the movie, which is hard. That's usually what happens to me is I'll start good in the beginning, but then halfway through the story, I'm caught up and I forget that I'm looking for the generic mission of the scene. So then I have to go back and start from that part that I skipped. So yeah, I mean, it takes some time, but that's why what I like to do when I'm deconstructing a story is I like to watch the movie probably like 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes 15 times. I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes I do that because it just helps me to not get caught up in the story anymore, and then I can actually break it down. So the first like 4 or 5 times I watch it, I might get caught up in the story, so I'm not gonna stop to think about the generic mission of the scene. But once I've seen it 6, 7, 8 times, well, now I'm not as caught up in the story. So now I can actually start to deconstruct it, and I don't get distracted. So I can find the plot points and in the missions of the scenes. So yeah, I mean, that's been my experience. That's how I learned story structure. That's how I learned how to tell stories. Yeah, I mean, if anyone has questions, put them in now because we are wrapping up our final discussion in this series. Again, we have a live call tonight with Larry and me. It's happening at 7 p.m. Eastern. I put the link to the webcast and also the phone number in the comments. It was like the first comment, I think. So if you just scroll to the top of the comments, you can get that and join us tonight at 7 p.m. Yes, there will be a recording. So if you can't be there live, don't worry. There'll be a recording. I'm going to send it out to my email list tomorrow. I'll post it on my Facebook page as well, so you can come back here and get it tomorrow. But yeah, I hope that this series has been helpful. I hope that you learned a ton. I've learned a ton, and I've been teaching it, but I learned a ton just talking about it and listening to you guys talk about it. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining me live, for everyone who joined me live each day. I had a lot of fun doing this. I think that this is something I need to do more of maybe. I don't know what other books we'll see, maybe another one of Larry's later. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's been a big learning experience for me, just getting to talk about this stuff more and write about it, and just sort of, again, because I think that it's really important to the most time you can spend being into this stuff and really just learning it, repeating it, studying it over and over and over and over again. Even though it's the same stuff, you sometimes catch different things and you hear it in a different way. Suddenly it makes more sense. Suddenly you have clarity. Suddenly something that was sort of fuzzy before came clear to you. So even though I've read Larry's books, tons of times, I, keep reading them because I learn something new every time. So like a couple of years ago when I was trying to learn more about concept and premise, I started reading his books again. And every time I did, I would just get more clarity on, okay, this is concept, this is premise. And now I can pick those out of a story just by looking at it or just by watching it. Wow, I did good. 30 minutes. Woohoo. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Again, I hope to see some of you tonight on the live call with Larry, 7 p.m. Eastern. Link and call in the comments. And I will catch you next time.